Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is Dr. Jim Hoven, and it is time for another episode of the Ramos Law Difference Makers podcast. I, as the host of this show, get an incredible opportunity to meet with people, visit with people, and hear their stories about how they're making a difference in the communities of not only people here in Denver, Colorado, but in the nation and even in some cases across the planet. So today is no exception to that guest list. And if you've listened to the show for some time, you may or may not know that we sprinkle in content from people who own businesses, people who have philanthropic efforts, and our own team. And today is one of those episodes where I have the distinct honor and privilege to interview a good friend of mine, as well as one of our world-class attorneys here at Ramos Law, Mr. Garry Rhoden. And the cool thing about Garry is, Garry's newer to the firm. I haven't been here for a decade. And the things that he has shared with me and taught me have been fantastic with respect to the type of client that he serves and now that we serve. And so I've kept you hanging on a little bit as to who that is. And so I'm going to share that now, then we're going to talk about it. So Garry heads up our protection of our elder group of people. So you can call it, and I'll let Garry, you talk to the specific term to it, but whether it's elder abuse and neglect or elder law, but you take care of those people who have served our country, who have committed their lives to us, and now they sometimes need some protection. So first off, welcome to the show. And Garry, thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hoven. It's nice to be here. And like you said, we have a division here at Ramos Law that focuses on, we call it long-term care injury division. So anyone that's elderly or not, that's in a skilled nursing facility or an assisted living facility that's neglected or abused, we represent those individuals and their families against the owners and the operators and the managers and the people that actually do the wrong to them through the civil court system.
And it's interesting because when you think about it, unless you've been through it, you don't understand at all. It's incomprehensible that a place would not take care of their patient, right? Like, I've never had someone, my parents specifically, go through a nursing home or skilled nursing facility. And my grandfather, he only went in for a very short time because he was at the very, very end of his life. When we look at this, can you explain the depth of the problem or the scope of the problem? How rampant is people not being well taken care for or not well cared for in those environments?
Yeah, I think it's fairly systemic, unfortunately. I'd say that it's not the individual caregivers that are going out and intentionally trying to hurt or harm someone many times. What it is, however, the owners and the managers and the operators that are insufficiently funding and supplying these facilities and putting their own employees in a position where they're going to fail. And so if you look at the data and the statistics from the Center for Medicaid Services, I think it pretty succinctly says and shows that the problem is systemic in our country, unfortunately. The number of nursing homes or skilled nursing facilities or assisted living facilities that are cited by the state and or the federal government, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that it's an epidemic.
So basically, if what I'm hearing you say is correct, it means that you have a facility that's owned by a private party. This is not a government-run thing. It's not necessarily a hospital. This is a privately owned organization that says we're going to take in people of a certain, whether it be age or ability level or disability level. When they take this on, if they're not paying attention, they're cutting corners in some way. That leads to the eventual trickle-down effect where the people that are going in there to live their, in most cases, their final years or the final chapter, something happens. Can you give some description of what some of the common issues are that these facilities end up causing on their clients?
Yeah, I would say, Dr. Hoven, that there's a few injuries that we see more, unfortunately, than others. One of those are bed sores or Decubitus ulcers that you see a lot, and it's really caused by staff not turning and repositioning someone that needs it frequently enough.
Is that because they're understaffed or undertrained, or why would that happen?
Well, everybody knows the training, right? They know what to do. It's just they don't have the resources or the time to do it. Unfortunately, many certified nursing assistants, licensed practical nurses, registered nurses that work in long-term facilities have too many patients to care for, too many residents to care for at one time.
Oh.
Corners get cut, things are missed. And when you're dealing with someone that's vulnerable, that depends on the staff for many of their activities of daily living, if they're not turning that resident frequently enough, then bed sores will happen. They happen on bony prominences, so they happen on the sacrum. Typically, they can happen on the back of the head. They can happen on the elbows. They can happen on the buttocks on either side. But it's just when you leave someone in a position for too long, the blood supply is cut off to the tissues, and tissue loss and damage occurs. And some of these pressure sores can be the size of literally of softballs. I've seen them the size of volleyballs, and they can go down to the bone. Can result in systemic sepsis. Can result in having people have their literally part of their bone cut out of their body because it's infected with something called osteomyelitis, or infection of the bone.
Right.
And these are really inexcusable things 99.9% of the time.
Yeah, they're preventable, because when you think about it, you don't go from having normal skin to one of these horrible ulcerated lesions, right? It's a progression. And so, they have to be there for a good amount of time, correct? Before it gets to that point. So someone hasn't paid attention or noticed for a long time and haven't treated what they've seen, is what I'm hearing you say on that issue.
That's right. And they go through stages as well, Dr. Hoven. So, for instance, the industry or the experts that stage these, the National Pressure Ulcer Advisory Panel, has 4 classifications for pressure ulcers, otherwise known as Decubitus ulcers. And they start out as a stage 1, which would be kind of a reddened area that's not blanchable, and progress all the way to a stage 4 where you've got deep tissue loss. They can happen quickly, but generally they don't, and there are warning signs along the way that are being missed, not just on a particular shift, but over a variety of shifts, over a variety of days sometimes, because folks are not doing their job. And again, here at Ramos Law, we support caregivers, and we know that they got into their profession for the right reasons. But unfortunately, there's good business owners, and unfortunately, there's not so good business owners that cut corners. They don't put enough staff on the floor. They don't have enough, as we say, hands on deck, and these things happen, like pressure ulcers. And another thing that unfortunately we see a lot is an elderly person that shows up at the ER that's profoundly dehydrated or emaciated because they've not been given enough food. And these, again, are, as a rule, these are preventable. The Center for Medicaid Services says they're preventable most of the time. There's exceptions to that, like there's exceptions to everything in life. But I would say the vast majority of cases we see of dehydration and malnutrition, they're absolutely preventable, and it's because the nurses have not followed the nursing process. They haven't assessed, they haven't properly care planned, they haven't reassessed, and they haven't checked that their plan is working. And many times, again, I hate to go back to the same thing, it's because the facilities are not staffed appropriately. And you mentioned something a while ago, Dr. Hoven. It is normally these are for-profit companies. There are some not-for-profit companies, but as a rule, if you look at the data from the federal government, the for-profit entities fail our elderly at a much greater extent than the not-for-profits do.
Is there any type of regulation, like at a restaurant, for example? They come in and they do inspections, and they see, is the surface clean that food is cooked on? They're looking for any kind of rodents or bugs?
Right.
Do they do that same kind of thing? And they're just not enough examiners to go check these facilities? Or how does it get to that point?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question and a good conversation to have. The federal government essentially funds for the skilled nursing homes. That is, the nursing homes that are providing physical therapy or occupational therapy or speech therapy, or that have a resident that has a feeding tube, for instance, that has a need for a higher level of skill than just being in an assisted living facility. The federal government regulates those, but they essentially outsource, if you will, the surveys of those facilities to the respective states. And so in the state of Colorado, the facilities are regulated by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and they will go around approximately every 18 months to do what's called an annual survey. They also go around to do complaint inspections. So if you have a loved one that's in a facility and you go in and you find your loved one that's obviously been sitting too long, and they've got, and I know this is a bit crude, but many times our clients will tell us that I came in and I saw my mother and she was laying in linens that were brown ringed and dried and had been there for a number of days, or found their loved one in feces and it was dried and caked on. And obviously it's been there for an amount of time, and you want to report that facility to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. They will send out and do a complaint investigation. And again, these folks are very important. They do a great job, but it's my impression over the years, and I've been doing long-term care work now for over 20 years, that in most states, the regulatory agencies themselves are not adequately funded and staffed. And so they miss a lot of things, unfortunately. In fact, there's been studies done in scholarly journals over the years that go back through the annual survey process and survey the surveyors and find that they miss, unfortunately, a large amount of deficiencies, they call it, that should have been found during that initial survey. And it's because, as we know, budgets are tight at every level of government. And unfortunately, when budgets are cut, many times they're cut in the area of funding surveyors and at the state level.
Wow. Well, let's take a step back for a second. We've talked about the magnitude of the problem being very high. The need for these facilities to be there and to be good is also very high. The number of people turning 65 every day is 10,000 people every day. 10,000 a day going into this population. Now, I don't know what the average age is of someone in one of these facilities, and I was kind of plinking around on the internet looking it up, and I couldn't really find it, and maybe but I'm telling you right now, there's a need for these entities to exist. We have to make sure they're done right, because with that many people turning that age, 65 every day, and it's expected by 2050 for 20% to 25% of our entire country to be in this age group, we got to get this done right.
Right, and funding, again, nobody likes their taxes to go up, me in particular, but funding is inadequate, right? Even in the state of Colorado, by the year 2030, we're not going to have enough money funded through and to and for elder care. And you really have two things going here. You have a population that's growing older because of the advances in healthcare, which we all love, right? But you also have the baby boomer generation that's getting older and meeting that age. And so we really are facing a tsunami in the next 10 to 20 years. And frankly, we're probably in it now when we're feeling the effects of it at this very moment. And
how do we go about, and we can talk about reform of the system and what you see as how we could make this right? Because obviously making people aware by saying, hey, if you have a problem, you need to say something, right? If you're visiting a loved one and something like this, you see something, you need to say something. And if they can't fix it, don't make it right. That's where now someone like yourself comes in, and we come in to step in to be that advocate. But is there a way that we can get to that point where, you're not needed as much, frankly?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I'm after 23 years of doing this, I'm not optimistic, Dr. Hoven. I probably, if you ask a police officer, can we get to the point where, we don't have any more violent crimes, he or she may say the same thing.
Yes.
It's going to take funding. It's going to take regulatory reform. It's going to take transparency in the people and the companies that own facilities. Unfortunately, the legislatures in most of our states, the court systems as well, allow operators and owners and managers of nursing homes to operate with impunity. And what I mean by that is they create a maze of corporations. And I'll give you an example. State of Colorado will license a limited liability company to have a license to operate a facility. That company will then have a management company that manages that facility. That facility may also have a pharmacy company that provides the pharmacy services. They'll have a nurse staffing agency that will provide agency staffing.
So they break it up into all these different pieces.
And they do that because they're obviously, what's their purpose, right? Their purpose is that when things do go wrong, and they know they'll go wrong because they're inadequately funding the facility, they want to be able to do that with impunity, i.e. they don't want to have to compensate someone that's injured that maybe has experienced hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills. Let's take a fractured hip, for instance, with a surgery. You could have bills and rehab following up that could be $500,000. And so many of them do that. They split these companies up into a myriad of different corporations that's essentially all owned and operated by the same individuals at the top in some holding company. And again, the legislatures in Colorado and in other states, and I'm not isolating Colorado or picking on it, because as a rule, most states are like this. But they allow them to do it. They allow them to get away with it. They grant licenses to these companies when they know this is how they operate. And look, when you don't have accountability at the top, bad things can happen.
We've seen that many times in many arenas, and this is another expression of that. Is there something then, okay, so let's stay on the issue before we get to the solution. On the issue side of things, let's say your aunt, uncle, mom, dad, grandpa, whatever is in one of these facilities. What does someone look for to make sure that their loved one is being treated correctly? And obviously, if you're not seeing that, that would indicate that they're being treated incorrectly. What are the signs or symptoms?
Yeah, great question, Dr. Hoven. I think one thing is the smell. What does the place smell like, right? If you go visit someone, a friend, and you go into their house and it smells musky, you probably know that person isn't doing their job keeping their house clean, and facilities are no different. And so that's an example or evidence of that someone doesn't have enough time to clean, right? To do basic cleaning and hygiene in the facility. So the smell's important. Call lights. Do you hear call lights going off for an inordinate amount of time? When you're in there visiting your loved one and your loved one needs to go to the bathroom, you push the call light. Does it take 15 or 20 minutes? Do you have to go to the nurse's station? And when you go, can you find someone? These are all bad omens that something could and probably will happen that's bad after a while. Because look, when you're elderly and you have slight dementia and you're in a facility, you need to go to the bathroom, you can't make the same clear judgments that you and I might maybe be able to make at our age, right? Thankfully, right now, we're not there.
So far, so good.
We will be there soon.
Absolutely. Sooner than I would like, by the way.
But if you leave someone in that condition and they have to go to the bathroom, they still have dignity. They don't want to soil themselves. So they get up, they try to go to the bathroom by themselves, and it only takes that one fall to break a hip. And we know that if you're over 65 and you have a fractured hip, your mortality and morbidity rate is very, very high.
Through the roof.
It's through the roof, and it goes up exponentially every year. And so we see, unfortunately, a lot of those cases at Ramos Law where loved ones, family members are put in a position where, they don't want to soil themselves. They've got slight dementia, slight confusion. They're on a myriad of medications. They're not making decisions like you and I are able to make today. And they have outcomes, and they fall and they break hips. And it's absolutely inexcusable for a caregiver to not answer a call light, and it's inexcusable for an operator or a manager of a facility to not have sufficient staff so that caregiver can answer that call light in a timely fashion.
Right.
And I like to say, Dr. Hoven, too, that imagine if this were daycares, right? Imagine if these were 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds that were being injured this way. Society would be up in arms. But for some weird reason, we have this epidemic amongst the elderly, and we're not doing enough about it.
Is it because it's not brought to the public? Do you not know or see this? Because, obviously, I did a little bit of research showing that there's about 1.4 million people in nursing homes. So that doesn't include, I'm sure, all these care facilities. So 1.4 million. Is it not brought to light because I don't know anybody? Like, what's holding that down compared to if it were children? Any idea on that?
I think there's a myriad of things. There's something out there that people a lot smarter than me that have studied. We hear about, sexism or racism, right? But there's something called ageism. And there's, in our society, unfortunately today, it's not like it was 50 years ago or 75 years ago where grandparents come and live in our homes. We're not able to do that like we would like to. We live in a fast-paced society. People have moved all over the country, family members. We're not near our loved ones so that they can do that. And we don't understand the elderly like we probably did in former generations. And so we tolerate things against the elderly that we would not tolerate against any other group or demographic, right? And I go back again to children. If a child was allowed to get out of a daycare facility and get hit by a car or fall in a ditch or get out in the weather and get frostbite, someone would go to prison. It would be on the national news. But unfortunately, these kind of things happen every day to the elderly.
And that's called elopement, right? If I remember right, as you were teaching me this stuff when we were going through it.
Yeah.
Because when I thought there's an elopement issue, I thought, oh, these old people are hooking up and getting married, and you know, and there's an issue here. But it means that they get out of the facility that they're entrusted to stay within, and then they get injured in some way, like you say, hit by a car or some sort of temperature-based injury or dehydrated or anything of that nature.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's because, again, it goes back to staffing. And most of what caregivers do in skilled nursing homes is basic custodial care, right? It's where is Mrs. Smith? Where is Mr. Jones, right? Where is Miss Ramirez? It's I go in and I turn them every 2 hours. Think about yourself if you have children, or the people watching have children. We changed their diapers when they needed it, right? We cleaned their bottom. None of us are caregivers, right? None of us went to nursing school or medical school, but it's that basic care that's the most important in skilled facilities. Keeping an eye on someone so they don't elope, turning them every 2 hours, cleaning their bottom sufficiently, making sure they have clean linen so that you reduce the spread of infections. It's really basic custodial services that are being performed. And most of those services are being performed by individuals probably with the least amount of education, but the hardest job, and also doing the job for the least amount of pay. And those are obviously called certified nursing assistants or nursing assistants. And again, we love nursing assistants here at Ramos Law. They're heroes, but unfortunately there's not enough of them, and the ones that are there don't get compensated fairly enough. And again, when you don't have enough hands on deck to do the job, it's foreseeable that you're going to have these kinds of injuries and these kinds of negative outcomes.
Now, let's say I'm going to visit my loved one in one of these facilities. If my loved one has dementia, it's not uncommon for them to start, saying things that maybe they mean, maybe they don't. So let's say someone listening has someone in this predicament or position. They go in and they speak with them, and that person starts saying, they're treating me horrible here. They're not taking care of me. They're hurting me. These kinds of things.
Yeah.
If you don't see physical evidence of that, you don't see bed sores, you might see bruising because the skin of the elderly bruises so much easier and it's so much thinner. What do you do if you're a consumer and your loved one is in a facility? You hear that kind of complaint, if you will.
Sure.
How do you go forward with that?
Well, I think the first thing you want to do is you want to have what's called a care plan meeting with the facility, and you want to sit down with the interdisciplinary staff. That would be social services and nursing and therapies. Each facility has a medical director, and you want to try to identify the cause of what's going on. It may very well be that the person isn't being physically abused, and let's hope it's not. And it probably isn't. But certainly there's something that's not right, and it needs to be identified. And this is where the skilled side of skilled nursing facilities come in, right? I mentioned a while ago that a lot of what they do is basic custodial care, but this isn't. So this is going to take a multidisciplinary team to figure out what's wrong with our loved one. They need to care plan the issue. They need to look at the factors that could be contributing to it, and then have a plan. And the other thing I'd say is to you out there, if you have a loved one like this, is this something that your loved one has done before? If it's new behavior or new activity, then that gives me a higher index of suspicion. If it's something that mom or dad or grandma or grandpa has done over and over again, then it doesn't necessarily give me as high index of suspicion. It may be that we need medication management, right? We may need someone that can come in and look at, the medications that he or she's being given for their cognitive deficits. And so I guess that's how I would answer that. I don't know if that's a perfect answer, but I think communicating with that interdisciplinary team is important. You're going to send a message to that facility that you're involved, that you're active, that you care, and they're going to hopefully listen to you and get to the root cause of that problem of what's causing, your loved one to make statements that probably aren't true. Let's hope, right? If we see evidence, of course, of abuse, if we see unexplained injuries, you're right. I mean, obviously the elderly have thin skin. Things happen, right? They bend over, they move around in bed. Bruising happens very easily, particularly if they're on anticoagulants. But if you see this continuously, right? If you see a pattern of this, then it's, again, have a higher index of suspicion that something is not right in that loved one situation.
And what about the opposite? I know in the case of other abused populations, whether it be young children, wives, these kinds of things, they will hold on to it. They're ashamed to admit it, that they're not able to protect themselves. Does that happen in this population as well, where they keep silent even though there's a problem going on? And how do we get through that?
It does. We particularly see that with individuals that have a cognitive deficit, such as dementia or Alzheimer's or vascular dementia or anything like that. These personality changes, quick changes in their normal baseline. If they're normally smiling and happy and all of a sudden, they're very demure in their outlook, they're not smiling, they're not talking, this behavioral change is something that needs to be investigated to figure out what the root cause is. Any type of change in their condition should have already been communicated to you before as it happened by the facility. As a facility, and a skilled facility, and even an assisted living facility, has a legal duty to communicate those changes both to that responsible party, and that's going to be the individual that the facility communicates with. It could be a power of attorney, could be a spouse, could just be someone designated by the treating physician to be the healthcare surrogate. They need to communicate those changes to that individual, but also to the physician, to make sure the physician's aware and involved and able to liaise, as it were, with the facility to try to, again, get to the root cause of the problem.
And this isn't the facility's physician. This would be the person's primary care outside of the facility that they've seen in the past?
That's a good question. It may be both. What we see a lot of times is, and this is unfortunate, many facilities will have a medical director, and that medical director will also serve as the physician for many of the residents in that facility. Many personal care physicians are not able or allowed to go into the facilities.
Oh, they're not even allowed to go in.
Right, and so you many times will have, grandmother or grandfather will have the same doctor for 30 years. They fall, they get pneumonia, they have some change, they go to the hospital, then they go for a short stint in a skilled nursing facility, and they'll end up with a different physician. And so it is a change, and it's something that is concerning to us that do this kind of work, to the professionals that are involved in caring for these types of patients. And, especially, like I said, the elderly, many of them have cognitive limitations, and it may not be Alzheimer's, it might just be some vascular dementia. So that's what causes memories to fade, and people repeat themselves over and over again. It doesn't mean they've got dementia. Doesn't mean they're dying. It just means they're growing older. And seeing these new faces in physicians can really be a problem many times. And so I think the family members and the responsible parties need to be cognizant of that having that different physician is a challenge. And so that's why it's so much more important for the facilities to be involved and communicating regularly with those physicians about changes in condition.
Okay, so if now you're thinking about a facility and you're trying to look at where you should go. In a little bit later, I want to know what those techniques or those criteria would be to find a great facility versus one where you're more at risk of having your loved one injured. But before that, I'd like to explore a little bit about the paperwork, because here's what I think, that if I'm looking at this from a facility owner, I'm like, okay, I have a duty to care for these people. I have a duty to make sure that they certainly don't get worse because of our care than what brought them here. But I also realize, hey, they're likely to slip and fall at a much higher rate than someone else. Do they throw little clauses in the contracts as you sign these documents to enter your loved one into one of these facilities, like, hey, no harm, no foul for us, we're going to try to indemnify ourselves? And what do you do if you see that clause? Do you need to take that to an attorney before you choose a facility?
Yeah, so obviously with the caveat that we're not engaged to give legal advice, but as a rule, if I were answering that question—
For educational purposes only.
For a friend or a family member that asked, I would say if you see the term arbitration, ARBRITHION, I'll get it right. If you see arbitration or arbitration agreement, scratch through it, don't sign it. And so what that is an attempt by the facility to limit its liability in some way before an incident has even happened. So here you are going into a situation where you're entrusting your mother or father to strangers, and they have you sign a stack of documents. They may not even explain to you what it means. And if grandma or grandfather does get injured due to the fault of that facility, they want to prevent you from going down and filing a lawsuit in the district court. They want you to go into some secretive process called arbitration that's not publicly available. There's no right. Our court system is open, right? Except for COVID limitations, normally we can go down and we can watch trials. We can read things in the public record that are on the computer system or go down to the clerk's office. But arbitrations are not public. They're private. And they're not, you don't have judges, you don't have juries. Typically, you might have professional arbitrators, or you might have sometimes retired judges. You might get one or you might get three, but as a rule, in my experience, the outcome for the families that are the victims of these kinds of wrongs is severely hampered by arbitration. I think arbitration might be fine if I'm buying a car. If I want to buy a house, maybe the builder has an arbitration agreement. Maybe AT&T to get my cell phone service. But when we're talking about life and death, right, and health care and providing custodial services, really it's an anathema to me that we would have an arbitration agreement. But unfortunately, good or bad, the courts will enforce those in Colorado. Okay. So if you sign it, you buy it. And if something unfortunately happens that's bad to you or a loved one, you're going to be stuck in this arbitration process. And you're probably not going to be able to get out of it. And you're not going to get your day in court at the end of the day. You're not going to get a jury of your peers to decide whether or not what happened was right or wrong.
Oh, wow. So that's a big deal. So for people listening or watching, it's important to look at those documents before you sign anything. And if you're not sure and you don't understand, then it's probably worth it to take it to an attorney to evaluate what that looks like.
And it's easy as we sit here, and those of you out there may even think this, well, why would someone sign that document, right? I wouldn't do that. But look, when it's 9 o'clock at night on a Friday and you've been given 2 hours notice that your mother is getting discharged from the hospital, and he or she's going to a skilled nursing facility, and you go down there and they put a stack of documents in front of you, and you're tired, you're stressed, you're a little scared, you just sign it, right? And so, but don't do that. And again, it's easier said than done. So I'm empathetic to people in that situation. My family's been there too. But again, just mark through it. You don't have to agree to it, regardless of what the person on the other side tells you. Sometimes we find that, facilities will have staff that will tell people they have to sign that document, but they don't. Just mark through it, put an X on it, and move on to the next page.
And so what I'm hearing you say is a little different scenario. Like my dad had a 5-way bypass. He's passed on now, but he had this big surgery and they moved him straight to cardiac rehab. They didn't give him a choice of 5 places. He ended up there and then had to go through all the deal. So let's say something like that happens. If you go there and like, look, I got to look at this. It's 9 o'clock at night. I'm tired. I got to look through this paperwork. So I can't sign this right now. Do they have the right to turn your loved one away at that point? Or do they have a binding agreement since they got shipped there from another facility that they have to give you 24 hours or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, we see all kinds of examples. So we see examples of what I gave you just now, right? 9 o'clock at night on a Friday. We see examples where the social worker from the facility, the skilled facility, will go to the hospital with the papers and have them sign there. So it varies situation to situation, but as a rule, your loved one's not going to be punished or not going to be denied admission because you refuse to sign that arbitration agreement. And just ask the person to show you the document, because many facilities in Colorado do use those agreements, and they use that to limit their liability for those situations that they may be responsible for later when harm is done.
And let's pretend for a minute that the worst case scenario happens and someone not only breaks a hip, but then dies in these kind of places. If the facility is not responsible, in the meantime, there's a long bout between breaking the hip and passing away. There's weeks or months, and you have a $500,000 medical bill. Who's responsible for that bill? At the end of the day, is it whatever insurance that the client/patient had?
Typically it is. A lot of facilities, not a lot, it depends on the state. In Colorado, most facilities will have insurance. Some states, like Florida, for instance, facilities have little to no insurance. So if we encounter a case that's meritorious and the facility doesn't have insurance, we'll prosecute the case against the company. and we will rely on the company to write the check, not an insurance company. But as a rule, Dr. Hoven, I would say in Colorado, the state does a pretty good job of making sure facilities have adequate insurance to compensate victims in these situations. Some states do a poorer job, though. And again, they allow facilities to operate with little to no insurance coverage, which might come to a shock to the folks listening.
It certainly shocks me.
You can't drive down the road without having
That's
insurance.
right.
But there are occasions where insurance policies have lapsed. In other words, premiums haven't been paid. There are occasions where facilities have so many claims that the facility's insurance has been exhausted. And so people just have to remember that just because someone has insurance doesn't mean that it can't be exhausted, meaning they've had a lot of other claims out there and the insurance company's discharged its obligation to its insured and paid all the money available under that policy. And in those cases, we'll look to the company itself to write the check. In other words, we will file claims against the licensee, against the management company, sometimes against holding companies, sometimes against real estate companies as well. Because again, most facilities operate with this corporate maze, this myriad of interrelated companies, in an effort to, you always call it, remember that game where you have the shells?
The shell game.
Right, the shell game.
Yep, move it around.
That's exactly what goes on in this industry. And going back to reform, that's one of the things that the state and the federal government could do and could put an end to, is that shell game and making things more transparent. There's been efforts over the years, but they've been inadequate.
So let's move the conversation to a more positive note and say, you and I need to move one of our loved ones into one of these facilities. What do we do? What do we look for? What criteria or list of things can we look to say, hey, there's no perfect solution potentially because of everything that we've talked about already, but the odds are if I find this set of circumstances, my loved one's going to be as safe as they can be?
That's a good question. I would say you would want to try to select a not-for-profit over a for-profit as a rule. You would want to try to select an organization that runs it. Sometimes synagogues, dioceses, that type of thing will operate very good facilities.
Would that mean look for anything with a saint something in the title?
You would think, but not always, because there's been some private equity hedge funds that have gone out and purchased a lot of traditionally parochial owned, and by parochial I mean a sort of a church or religious institution or body, right? An owned and operated facility. There's been a lot of private equity money that's actually gone out and bought those facilities because they have such good name recognition in the community. So you really have to dig a little deeper than just the name. I would also say that as a rule, check Yelp, check Google reviews. That's a good indicator. Go on and just Google Medicare Compare. Medicare CMS runs a website where they will list out what their surveys are, and you can find out what their deficiencies are. You can find out there's a 5-star rating. It is true that facilities can manipulate the 5-star rating because the government doesn't audit what they're told by the facilities. But as a rule, a 5-star facility is going to be better than a 1-star facility. Where it becomes difficult, however, is when you're at the hospital with your loved one, and that's generally the trajectory that people take, right? They've had pneumonia, they've gotten sick in some way, they go to the hospital, they've had some muscle wasting or muscle loss, they become weaker, they can't go back home by themselves. Social worker will come visit you from the hospital, and you'll get a list of options that are available. So unfortunately, the pie isn't always full. And so you may only have one choice for your loved one at any one given time. So you're kind of at the mercy of what's available most of the time, unfortunately. Because again, if you live in Longmont and you want mom or dad to be close to you, maybe there's a great facility in Vail, right? But you don't want mom or dad to be there because you can't visit them, right? And so visitation is important. So in an ideal world, you would be able to have the pick of the litter, as it were, but unfortunately, you're really going to be limited in your options, and you're going to have to just make the best decision that you can at the time.
And does it depend if you have long-term care insurance, like if the person has long-term care as part of their policy, is it like a doctor where it's only good for this participating vendors?
It may be. Each policy is different. As a rule, though, with Medicare, right, you're gonna be able to pick whoever's available, and that facility obviously has a decision in this as well, right? Because the facility has a duty to only accept residents, and they're called residents. They're not patients in long-term care facilities. They have a duty to only accept residents that they can adequately care for. And so they should be doing an analysis as well to tell whether or not they can provide that level of care that your mother or your father, your grandfather needs, right?
Boy, that's a big point, Gary. I think we need to hit on that for just a moment. What if now that we know that and we're going into that, is one of the critical questions to ask, based on what you see in my loved one's medical records, do you feel like you have the adequate facilities to take care of them? Like, to me, that would be a really important question.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just say, your mother or father has dementia and they wander, right? They get outside. That's something important to ask. Do you have a secure memory care unit, right? What is it staffed on the weekends? What is it staffed at night? Will my loved one, get a bracelet? What if they get out of the facility? Will there be an audible alarm that goes off somewhere, right? We have alarms on our homes, and if someone breaks in, we'll get a phone call or a text right on our phone. We may even be able to look at a camera on our phone and see who's there. Same thing, right, at a facility. So you want to ask those particular questions that are relevant to your loved one's condition, whatever that condition may be. And so let's just say you've got a loved one that has had pressure ulcers before. We want to raise that with the facility, make sure they know about it, make sure they're care planning that issue, and that they're routinely reassessing that plan to make sure that plan's working.
What about this? And this just popped into my head. There's often a degree of continuum that goes from someone leaving their own home to ending up, say, in hospice. So this first step is an independent living where I come and go as I please. I can have my dog, I can park my car, and then I move from on campus from that place into something where they need to take care of me. Do we find this same kind of issues that we've been talking about today at the earlier stages of that, or is it typically once I'm no longer independent and that's where more of the problems start to happen?
Yeah, and again, this sounds like a hedge of an answer, but I think sometimes you will see individuals that go from their home, maybe the yard's too big, right? Maybe the taxes get too high and they decide to sell the home, move into an apartment that's an independent facility. Typically, those facilities will provide 3 meals a day, and they'll have social activities for the individuals living there. They'll have cleaning that comes out once or twice a week. But as a rule, you can have your dog there, you can have a car, that type of thing, right? It's an apartment. You bring all your belongings with you that you can fit into your apartment. And then as that person gets older and the needs increase, maybe they go into an assisted living facility where they have maybe medication management, right, to make sure that mom or dad are taking the right medications, but they have limited nursing services. And then after a time, maybe they need something more skilled, right? Maybe mom or dad's dementia accelerates to such a degree that they're not eating, they're not drinking, and they need someone there to cue them and remind them. But oftentimes, Dr. Hoven, what you find is that someone's 88 years old and they fall and they break their arm, right? And they've lived independently for all 88 years or 98 years, and they go from living in home to living in a skilled facility.
So most of the issues aren't happening until you get to the skilled facility. Like, there's not many claims, so to speak, of abuse or neglect while you're able to take care of yourself. Is that accurate?
That's right. I would say that's accurate.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I think that leads us to the most important question. If someone has experienced this, they think they're experiencing it, when does an attorney get involved? When do they go, okay, if they went to the medical facility or to the medical director team at the facility and say, hey, I want to report this, you come up with a game plan, I think there was a problem here. When is it that they should call someone like us, someone like you, in order to say, I need help with this?
Yeah, I would say when you've run out of your options, and I hate to say that because it sounds a little crass, but when you've done everything that you know how to do, in other words, when you've communicated with the floor nurse, the charge nurse, if that hasn't worked, you've asked to speak to the director of nursing. If that doesn't work, you try to speak to the administrator, the executive director. Then you have a care plan meeting. If you've kind of run out of where you are and what you feel like you can do, I think that's an appropriate time, to call an attorney. And then the other thing I'll say is too, even though we're focusing on injury claims, individuals when they get elderly, they need to have an estate plan, and so you can get an attorney involved even when you don't have a particular issue with the facility, to make sure that you've got the right power of attorney for your mother or your father, that the living will is in place, that your mother or your father's wishes will be honored at the end of their life. Don't wait too long, right? It happens quicker than we think. Don't wait until mother or father are in a coma and you never had that conversation. They've never made that choice, right, to decide what do I want my end wishes to be in a living will. And then a will, right? A last will and testament. The state has a plan if you don't have your own will, but it's always better to choose your own will and choose how you want to dispose of your assets at the end. And we don't do that kind of work here, but we have friends of our firm that do that kind of work, and we'd be happy to refer you to those individuals that can help with those estate plans as well, even though it's not per se an injury claim. But we take all kinds of calls here at Ramos Law every day. And we know when we sit down and talk to those folks for 30 or 40 minutes that we're probably not going to represent them, but we're just trying to help them navigate what is a confusing process.
Well, man, I will agree with you on that, because I think I mentioned a little earlier, my dad passed away a few months ago, and it was very unexpected. He had cancer, and we knew he was in stage 4 cancer, but the damage was minimal considering the condition was maximal, if that makes sense.
Right.
And as it turns out, he and I had conversations. I'm the only child, and so he had let me know what he wanted when his lifespan was done. In the meantime, he ends up getting sepsis and passing away literally in 24 hours. And so thank goodness we had the plan in place, because it made my job so much easier emotionally, because I knew what to expect. I knew where things were, because of things like wills and understanding what he wanted, and cremation and burial and all of this stuff we had talked about. So I can't thank you enough for bringing that to light, because people, it does happen faster than you think.
And it's not an easy conversation.
No.
It's not one that anyone cherishes or wants to have, but it's an important one to have, because Amen. Again, when you, it really, it's a great act of love to your kids to have that conversation, regardless of how painful it might be for you as the dad or you as the child, right? To give those last wishes, and you can do it verbally. The best way to do it is to have it in a living will that's written.
That's right.
And there's no discrepancy. There's no there's no question about what those wishes are,
Yes.
and that's important. And we see that many times when clients will come to us right at the end of maybe mom or dad has suffered a broken hip. And then they've been put in hospice, and they don't have a will. They don't have a living will. There's no power of attorney even, right? And again, power of attorney can be drafted in such a way that your mother or father isn't giving up their rights, their independence. It's just saying that, look, if I end up in a certain situation, this person can make certain decisions for me, and then here's the directions that person needs to follow. And the healthcare providers will make sure that they follow that.
That is critically important. And again, having lived it, I will tell you firsthand, it made all the difference in the world. Having the things in writing, having the conversations, it all made difference. And I think, Garry, you hit it on the head when you said we have these kind of calls every day, and we either can help people as the first 3 quarters of our conversation have gone with, if they haven't been taken care of the way they should have in one of these facilities, or we have some great resources if people need estate planning side. So as we end this, would you just share how people can get a hold of you if they have questions about this? Because I'm sure it's piqued their curiosity, if nothing else, or if they know someone that they might just want to ask you a couple questions. How would they get a hold of you?
Yeah, just Google, look on ramoslaw.com, and under the attorney section, and you'll see my number, and give me a call or shoot me an email, and I'll get back with you.
Absolutely. And just so you guys know, the number here is 303-733-6353. That's the general number. And so you can call that number, and then we'll get you over to Garry's extension as well. So Gary, thank you, man. Thanks for taking the time. I know it's been a busy day. It's been a long day. I've seen you grinding all day today. So to finish your day with me with this, for this critically important message to the community, I just can't thank you enough. And it's a pleasure and a joy to work with you every single day.
And you too, Dr. Hoven. Thank you. Thank you for listening, everyone.